I feel like that session was very grounding, kind of reminding us of the reason we're in the room today, to speak about health equity and what that means on the ground when you're truly involved in the day-to-day. For me, the words that were uttered by Qawekazi, we are in the middle of a care crisis. And I found myself thinking, how long have we already been in a care crisis? And how much has the pandemic only illuminated the nature of this crisis and of a lack of access to care? And I think that it also reminded me to be mindful of our global conversations about access to abortions, about access to gender-affirming healthcare for LGBTIQA folk. And I think that I'm really grateful for all that was shared. I'm grateful for all the work that you do, and I think I speak for all of us. We now turn our eyes to our fourth film, which is called The Undocumented, as we start to consider a part of what was captured in that conversation, which is labor. This film, The Undocumented, focuses on women on mines and was created by Lesedi Mogwatle and Yumna Martin. And it will be followed by a conversation moderated by Tekano Lifelong Fellow, Ntebaleng Morake.
Amalahle sewatshontsha kulima yini ngale njengamhlanje kuyisande yabelungu ayinthabekho kunalabantu abasebenzayo siyabaqela bathi nize ngesikhathi siso abelungu boye babangekho nize nizingolovani nedi nizifihle ingolovani bangaziboni basikepela amalahle besingafuni ayagujwa ngapha kulima yini akudala ngale mara kusekudeni besingabe asipasi lamalahle le dafu lebe sikiyizolo iyavutha ithi qeda amasenge yiwo la iqedela amasenge lawo ngifike la eMNS ngabasayona istofu nganaso lesi iyavutha ibuvuzela ngamanzi ubumbe futhi so kamnandi kabi neda amasenge namabhodo hayi kuyaphela shame lento le bathi yiyo le bageza ngayo lamalahle ledaka leli thina siyaligubha siyabasa
uqasha nje hayi kunzima nje kusele udize kodwa ngaziwenze kanjani ukuthi uzokhona ukuthola umsebenzi emayini awungeneki isimaliso
la emayini the most vela ngifuna uqamba kusebenza amazulu nabantu abahlala abanye emalokishini siyanqoba hayi ukuthi abafuni inkinga enkulu la banenkinga iyi-1 abantu balaba understand umlungu la uthi nayo imshini qela namaphephe nawo umshini uthola ukuthi MNS yonke ngekhona amaphephe abelungu sabathatha ngaphandleke bayakwata ke sokwenza itoyitoyi
ID kuqala ukuthi umama bekanganayo and then umama makayitholi ayidinga kwabanzima kuye ukuthi ayingenzise ngokukhula komuntu omdala bona ngizama ukuthi mama yamtshela yabona umuntu omdala vele yabo mara naye uzamile yabo balo basijikajikisa bathi bafuna le ncwadi ngibuye nayo balo bangijikajikisa yabo zange ke wazi wangishiya mara ngifuna kakhulu ukuthi abantwana bami esikoleni bayefuna certificate abantwana nami ngizokhona ukubaholela ngikhona ukuphila ngikhona ukuhlala nabo.
Seza ngokusiza ugogo la MNS because ugogo washela i-caravan. That's where we start our work and we saw a gap ukuthi this community needs our help. So that's where we lobby and for this community ukuthi this community should babe nama rights wabo because we feel like this community doesn't have rights and ama mining companies abathatha for granted because baglinda wabakiyo. So Tina, we are helping them with legal issues for them to stand for their rights. And also we are helping most of the communities with groceries and dignity pets. Yes. And sometimes when they need our assistant, mhlambe there's someone who's sick, then they contact us and we make means to come and collect them and take them to the hospital, where they should go. The relationship yam nothuli, it's a very good relationship because uthuli ngammeet 2016 when I'm starting to do this job through her late mother. Yeah, bingazi ugogo, then that's how I meet Thuli and ugogo relate story sakhe ukuthi kwenzakalani empilweni yakhe unomntwana bathuthulu nabazukulu. So I've got a good relationship with Thuli. I'm helping Thuli with whatever I have. I feel like we didn't do enough because as you can see, people are still living. Since I started working here, people are still living in the same houses. There's nothing changed. We have tried to engage with the municipality to intervene so that people can be moved to the other side in Clarinet so that they locate them, the RDPs. But unfortunately, it's not happening. We even involved the mayor in one stage. She was saying that she will come and have a look, and they will also tell you that these people, they don't have proper documents, so that is why they can't get the houses.
Mama umbangisiza ngoba uthi maka thola ID wenze grant bese siphila ngemali grant and nami ngikhona ukuthi ngiya kodasi ngiyahereza ngithole lokho ngitholayo siphile endlini njengamanje ngiyofuna uLosine ngimherezweni. Ngizama kabuhlungu ngikhuluma ngomama. Noma vele ngihlezi nje angikhorathi nje ngicabanga nje inhliziyo yami ibabuhlungu nje umuntu ebengihlala naye nginaye vele sonke isikhathi.
Ngoba phela yazi bekasangizisho ubuhlungu ngapha kana-ID ngapha unabantwana ngathi yazithule abaye phandrish asimuphi usonto labantwana need until ulungise indaba ye-ID, after ID sokubuya abantwana.
Isusonto lohlala nabo labantwana uyozama ukukhuluma esikolweni ukuthi usazama ukuthi kutholakala i-ID yami uzokhona ukwenzela abantwana certificate. Cha ngiboni nje ukuthi impilo yami ngifuna ibe se-MNS nanga thuthuka nje ngibe nendawo kahle ngihlale kahle nabantwana bami. Ngoba i-MNS ayikho right shame. Ayikho right izibhobozo matrak dust abantwana ngeke babe right.
Njengalana abantu abaningi babulawa isifuba, ukhohlela ngedust, i-TB, abanye badla ama-ARV. Siyahlupheka ngamanzi hayi kancane. Ne-dust nalamaroli ukuthi zzz la phansi. Lana kunamuntu osizayo. Ikhansela yilo leli belikosa ukuthi likhethwe manje kuyaliwa.
Yazi siya complain mara ngibona umehluko mina. Angibona umehluko ngoba nalaba bathi ma committee ini nje akukho into ebayenzayo sibonayo.
Nzima reg. Mara wele sothini siyaphila. Anganampuphu nginempuphu siyapheka siyadla soyithu. Impilo iyaqhubeka. Ngithola i-peace job ngoba yinakana ID, benze i-peace job ngihole, thenga impuphu ngapha, thenga impuphu ngale. Impilo iyaqhubeka.
You know, these films and this project is so important. And as the day goes on, I just get more and more aware of the importance. And I'd like to invite Yumna and Lesedi up, as well as the two activists who worked with them on this film, so that we can just honor you and hold you in this moment. And thank you for your work. Thank you so much for everything that you do and everything that you are doing. I'd like to invite Ntebaleng Morake now up, who will be the chair of the next panel.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think before I sit down, I also just want to invite our panelists for today, Sithandiwe, Salimah, and Dr. Asanda Benya. Please join me. I think before we start, I just want to say that Black women's lives, within what Bell Hooks terms white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and we may even add, right, and talk about white supremacist, capitalist, neoliberal, sexist, heteronormative patriarchy. Our lives in this context are multi-layered, they are dynamic, they are complex, but definitely not ahistorical. And I think what we've seen with this particular film has shown us. I think it's shown us that the lives, particularly of women in mining towns, are lives of a story shaped by economies of violence, economies of naturalized exclusions of women. And I think just to start off the panel, I just want to maybe ask the panelists to reflect on the politics of documentation in the context of labor power and in the context of neoliberal labor power. I'll start with you, Asanda.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon or noon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to Tekano, and thank you, Debe, for also agreeing to chair the session. The politics of documentation. I mean, I'm not going to answer the question directly, but I'm going to answer the question by telling a very short story around just labor in South Africa, right? Labor history in South Africa, the way in which we've captured what's happened historically in the country. That when you approach labor historiography or labor scholarship in the country, what you will encounter, or you will encounter mainly, predominantly, it's men. There's not a lot that's written. There is some now especially, and there are some voices that are coming out from women, but historically it's really been capturing and documenting the stories from the experiences of men. The assumption is that when you're talking about worker or labor, that you're talking about a male body, but in mining it's even more pronounced, because when you think about the mines, for most people they think about men, and so when you're thinking about the documentation in mining specifically, it's mainly the stories one of men, but also the perspective of men, or the experiences are told from the perspective of men, and very little coming from elsewhere. But that's also changing. So that's on the mining, but also that's on mining and that's on labor generally. And then you come to unions, because I think the story of unions and unionization is the story of resistance, and it's the story that we all need to constantly reflect on when we're thinking about workers. And as much as we talk about exploitation, also talk about resistance. How have people been responding to all of these things, the oppression and so forth? But even when you go to those stories around how people have been responding, so the story of unions, again, the dominant voices are the male voices. So even in that documentation of the story of unionization in the country, the dominant voices continue not only to be men predominantly, but to some extent invisibilization of women's contributions. I mean, when you talk to people about some of the key figures, women who have been at the forefront of building the labor movement in the country, a lot of people don't know who those women are. A lot of people don't know, for instance, that some of the most defining strikes in this country were started by women. When we think about in labor studies, we think about the 1970s, that period. That strike, or the strikes in the 1970s, are told as the strikes that were started by these dock workers, but actually they were also started, the very first people who put their tools down, put their sewing machines down, and these were women who were working as seamstresses and so forth, and men followed. So there's, in the documentation, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's that invisibilization, but I think there's a lot of work that people have also been doing to undo that, or to center, or to at least make visible the contributions of women.
Thank you so much, Sanda. I want to ask, maybe Sita, that's when you can come in, based on sort of your work. I think we've seen both historically and very recently, I guess in the context of FISMO's fall, and even just like organizing, right? That the discourse or the shaping of land has been made to be, has been positioned as a non-feminist issue, right? So in spaces of activism, men bring up the question of land as a way of silencing women, when we actually know that land is a deeply, deeply feminist project, right? It's not agendered in any way. So how do we then, and I want us to link us to a question of resilience and resistance, and how those two things coexist, but how then do we reclaim the narrative of land? Because if there's anyone who needs land, it's black women, right? It's the most marginalized people in our society. So how do we reclaim that aspect that has been positioned as a very patriarchal discourse, when in fact we are the Beyoncés of the land question? We are, sorry, truth.
Sounds like an answer, not a question.
Did it just say Beyonce?
I mean, that's also another, yeah.
Okay, firstly, thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to Tekano. I'm very happy to be here. Oh, okay, so, you know, as you were talking earlier, I was looking at my notes and I'm saying, I wonder what on my notes is she gonna ask about? And what if she asks nothing about these notes? What am I gonna say? Okay, so, no, you're absolutely right that the discourse around land, I mean, if you think about the dominant discourse, like at least in the past two years, has been on the issue of land expropriation without compensation. And it has been led, the voices that have been led in this discourse have been mainly men, but not just any men, whether politicians or just people who have access to media, so political analysts, academics, and so on. And we've had very little about the people who actually need land. Who is this land for? When you're talking about land reform, returning land, land for whom and for what are the questions. And in my research, I do research on former labor tenants. So maybe just briefly, so labor tenancy was a system of extracting cheap or free labor from black people who had been dispossessed by whites. So the white became landowners, and in order to expand their production and commercialize, and so the big farms that we see today, so that was built by the labor tenancy system, but not only, just as one of the systems that built there. So black people were displaced, and then they were forced into providing labor for 6 months without pay, unless the white man was in a good mood on that day, and they would get a 5 rand after 6 months. And this labor was performed primarily by women. So it depended primarily on the household, which was a man, to make available labor of his children to meet the demands of the white man. So if a white man needs, I need 3 girls to come and clean and work in the garden and do ABC for 6 months, as a father of that household, you would say, okay, you can't go to school, you have to go and work, because if you don't, we're gonna be evicted. So that was the condition. And this continued for years. So to build the agriculture that you see today, it was that kind of labor. Which when you hear debates on land reform, you don't hear about that labor. You just hear about land, as if it's just going to be this empty piece that must be returned. And maybe to then bring in the voices of women, the ones that I work with, it's women living on these farms in rural parts of KZN and in Mpumalanga provinces. I'll just read a quote from one of the meetings that we had about 2 months ago, where we were talking about this, because these are land claimants, and they're talking about pushing the state to accelerate these land claims. So I call her Mama K, and then I'm going to read her quote. So she says, "This is not just about getting our land back. What about the many years I worked from the age of 13 as a domestic worker at the white farmer's house, cleaning the house, looking after their children, doing their laundry, and working in their gardens for 6 months every year, mostly without pay, unless the white farmer was in a good mood, and he would pay me 10 rand at the end of 6 months." Now, so what Mama K, this is an old woman in her 70s, the question that she asked, she's not the only one who's asked this question. I've encountered similar questions in my research many times. I have tons and tons of quotes when I ask women, so what would be justice to you if you talk about your history? Well, they're like, compensation. But it's not the compensation we hear about on the radio when we listen to the EFF or to the white farmers in Agri-SA, where they talk about compensation for them. So they want to be compensated for giving the land back. Here, she's not talking about that compensation. She said, why aren't we not the center of this debate on compensation? Who should be compensated here if we take history seriously? Who was displaced? Who put their labor But not just that, a lot of opportunities were lost. People had to leave school, were forced out of school, a range of things. People lost their livestock. The white men would take your livestock and you never see it again. Where is the compensation for that? So what Mama K is inviting us to do is, when we think about this debate around land, who should be at the center? Who is the land for? Yeah, so I'll pause there for now.
Who is the land for? So in the context of land, the political economy of mining, and just, I guess, globally, we have seen an appropriation of feminist language, an appropriation of feminist struggles, feminist discourse, right? And I want to bring this and locate it, like I said, in the context of the political economy of mining, around, for instance, the African mining vision speaks of a more gender inclusive mining sector, right? And that this idea of bringing in more women in an environment that isn't transformed, that still is very neoliberal, still is not liberatory, I guess, in its practice. How do we then make of that appropriation of feminist language, feminist activism within spaces that are actually still stand against things that we're collectively trying to build in terms of rebuilding a society that does not consider us as the other?
I think I got the hardest question. I'm still thinking about the earlier questions. Okay, let me try to take a little bit of everything.
Okay.
First, on the politics of documentation. We saw one documentation in the film, but there are many other women in mining that we do not hear about. I want to tell you a story about asbestos miners here in South Africa. This is an industry that stretched from the 1890s to 1980. Half of the labor force were women. Do we know this story? I looked at mining in this way to document it in this book. This is a book about the future of the mining industry, but of course we trace back the history to understand how the future might look, and of course to make connections to the present. This is how I came to the story of the female asbestos miners. These women were key to the high profitability of this industry from the early 20th century right up until the end. Why? Because of the work they did. So, they did not work underground. They worked on top. They therefore had direct contact with asbestos, with the mineral. The men would pull the big chunks out of the ground. The women with hammers would break these chunks, right? Breathing it in, right? We know about breathing through COVID. Those smaller chunks were now fed into the mill of the factory to again bring out the asbestos that's tucked into the rock. So most women were working in that. It's called cobbing. But a quarter of the women were now taking the smaller rocks out of the mill and pulling out the long asbestos fibers. Why? Because those captured a higher price on the world market. And that breaking of the stone that 3/4 of the female labor force was involved in, that saved the machines. It allowed for less rock and dust to enter the machine. So, in the 1950s, when legislation changed and women were no longer allowed to work on the mine site, guess what happened in asbestos? They got an exemption. Those women kept on working because the industry was exempt from the law. So there's a politics of documentation. It's a bit more complicated, right, than just men and women. We need those women there because they're going to do the jobs that men don't do. They're going to further increase the profitability of the industry. But how are they paid? These women were paid through men. So mainly their partners were the ones working underground. Their salary came through the male salary. So to now study this is difficult. When we want to document, we have to then search hard. I found a study by epidemiologists done in the early 2000s. They located 770 women who had been asbestos miners in the Northern Cape. The industry was the Northern Cape and Limpopo. Of these 770 women, they tested their lungs. 91% had asbestosis. What care was there available for them? Was it made available after the study? And when the compensation was negotiated through different legal claims, how much of that went to women? There's another documentation problem for us to look up. Most of those women spent 10 years in the asbestos mining industry. So you can imagine the damage that is done in 10 years. You can imagine the numbers of women that just died, that we can never now talk to. On the Africa mining vision, so throughout the continent, as we know, there has been a reinvigoration of mining exploration, and this is in a very capitalist way that is different from what was done in the early post-independence period in most of the mining-rich countries in the continent. So in the 60s, 70s, what happened is that governments saw the need for the mineral wealth in the continent and tried to take some control of the industry, tried to get larger amounts of the surplus that was being generated by the workers, but taken by mainly multinational mining companies. So much of the industry was nationalized in Africa, especially the very rich, mineral-rich countries. But that was done on the basis of borrowing money on the world market during a time when money was cheap. So there's a whole long story to that. Please ask me the question later. But as the US, the major world power now and then, tried to bring the money back into the US, the price of money went up. And that is how the vast majority of African countries became very indebted to the big banks around the world. Through that process, we started to see conditions being attached to loans. That's how we lost the public health care systems that African governments had set up, the larger public education programs that had come in the 60s and 70s, and it is how the private mining companies from around the world got back into African mines and mineral wealth. The Africa mining vision now comes in about 2010 to try and get African governments involved again in the industry, but it is in a very neoliberal manner. So it's very limited in what the state can do, but there is a bit more power they are trying to gain as the different African government members of the African Union. And so, as you say, in the great neoliberal age and culture, women, in a very limited sense, are included. So women are encouraged to do more informal mining. Well, what are the working conditions there? What are the living conditions? How do women actually benefit from the diamonds they may be picking up in the Northern Cape, which we also talk about in this chapter? We went to talk to artisanal diamond miners in the Northern Cape. How do they make money from those rocks that are left behind by De Beers when they have to sell it to the big guy at the top? And what safety do they have when they actually earn something, when they live in a shack that doesn't even have a door?
I want to bring it closer to us, right? Asanda's like, what? Around, and I guess this is in the context of us reflecting on Mam Winnie's life, and I'm paraphrasing her about, she says that there's nothing that the apartheid government had done to her, and now she had gotten to a place where she has no fear. And I think sometimes when we speak about resistance and resilience, we think about it from a perspective of like really big stuff, right? So like structural resistance, structural resilience. And I'm interested in how then our everyday practices of resilience and resistance look like. How do we become resilient every day? How do we resist every day, right? For me, it's, I guess, simply existing unapologetically as a black woman, right? It goes back to what the previous panel was saying, that you're showing up into a space that says that you don't belong here, right? And you're claiming that narrative and you are cementing yourself. Thank you, what? Zozi. But I'm interested in how, I think it's quite unexplored, and therefore sometimes we can think that we're not doing a lot. But I'm interested in everyday practices of resilience as a form and methodology of activism.
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
Okay. Well, before maybe I start, I'll just go back to some of the things Salimah mentioned. You know, when she's talking about the defunding of the public health care, or the defunding of, so like just generally what happened with structural adjustment programs in this continent, I think we like to think of it, or sometimes we think of it as something that's so far from us. Actually, it's so close to us. When I think about the fees strikes that we saw in the past couple of years, fees must fall, that's directly linked to the story she was telling. So it's not something that's far from us. When I think about we had people who are working in healthcare just now up on stage, and when we think about the appalling way in which the public healthcare system in this country is, the state of the public healthcare system in South Africa, that's directly linked to all of this defunding that we've been seeing in the past couple of years. I know that the dominant story in South Africa is always, oh, it's the corruption, it's because of the government and the budgeting. But I think the other and the bigger and the much more real and structural story for me is the story that goes back to what Salimah was talking about, that our governments were put under so much pressure, and they have been, to a point of defunding all of these things that we need. And so when we see a lot of people in our country dying of COVID, it speaks to also the story of the mining industry and how it's evolved over the years. But another thing that Salimah mentioned, these asbestos women miners, I want to talk also just as a way of linking it up, because she's talking about the women who were working and who died working in these mines but were not recognized while working in these mines, and this was their male partners. But there's the other story also that connects South Africa also to the rest of the continent, but especially to Southern Africa. And that's the story of women had husbands coming to South Africa to work in these mines, and these husbands also, because they were exposed to, in this case of gold mining in particular, they were exposed to lethal levels of silica dust. Where did they go for their holidays? They went back home. Where did they go when they got sick with this silica dust that was in their lungs, they went back home, and it was women who was taking care of these men, right? And so the story of mining, it's not just within the mining workspace, but it's how the mining industry has continued to benefit. It continues to benefit even when it no longer has men working or when it no longer has women, because it was these women who were working as healthcare workers for their husbands. Mining industries were like, we are retrenching you, your lungs are no longer. It was women who had to take care of these people, whether as wives or women as sisters to these men. And I think there's a film that was produced a couple of years ago that demonstrates the extent of this, the pressure and all of the work that women are absorbing, yet it's not recognized and it's not accounted for, that actually women are exploited by the mines even when they're not working in these mines. So when we're talking about exploitation, it's not just of the workers, but it's also of the women who aren't even recognized because of this care work that they do. And the fact that this spreads throughout the region is not just a South African thing. I think that's what's scary for me. But a couple of years ago, mining companies were also talking, and there was a case and they won. Mining companies are fighting, well, former mine workers taking the mining companies, there was this big class action lawsuit taking mining companies to court for exposing them to this lethal silica dust. And they won, but it's not a lot of money. But guess who does not even feature in who will be compensated? It's the women. And yet it's not just the death that we need to be compensated for. It's not just that we were sick, but it's also that we infected our families through the exposure. But it's also that people were taking care of these workers for years. People get sick with silica dust and think there's medical professionals in that room. They'll tell you that you can live with it, but a terrible quality of life for years. And a woman or lots of women have had to either give up their jobs in order to take care of their husbands who are doing this kind of work. But the externalities of it also are the diminishing health and quality of life for family members when you have such a situation. But also we've seen a lot of women who are saying that now we are also getting sick because we took care of these husbands or of these men for years. Now we have cancer, we have all of these things, asthma and so forth. So that story of how the mind keeps eating away at us is not just in at the coal face or in the asbestos at the top level. It also extends, and this speaks not just to our past, but it speaks to the future also, because their children are also getting sick now. They were exposed to this for years, and so it speaks to also the future. So when we're thinking about all of those, I think these are things that we need to. So now going back to your question around resisting daily. I mean, I think there's different layers one could answer that question, but I think about some of the work that I've been doing around Marikana, women in Marikana and resistance there. I think for me, just the level, the ways in which they've been pushing back, you know. These are women who are living in informal settlements, much like the women that we've just seen now in these, but the fact that every day they are pushing back against this level of exploitation that is normalized, I think that for me is really, it speaks to the question you're raising around resistance. And it's not the grand resistance where people are going to strike outside, but it's the fact that every day you get up and you push back against, every day you get up and you make demands that I demand A, B, C, D. The mine has taken our land, as Tar was, or the farm has taken our land, but every day we're actually going to push back and demand to be heard, demand for services to come here. If we are working for you without any remuneration from the mining companies, we deserve proper housing. We deserve running water. In fact, you've stolen our running water from us, and we're going to demand. So there's that level also. And then I think there's the level at the personal that you were also referring to.
Thank you so much, Star.
Yeah, maybe just to add to the last point that Asanda raised. It's resistance, but primarily it's a question of survival. Because we are in a huge crisis. Right, so historically, when black men were sent to work in the mines and the land was depossessed and so on, the idea was everybody's going to become a worker. But there is no work today. So we have there's no work. There's high levels of unemployment, whether in urban areas, rural areas, it's the same. There is a crisis of social reproduction. But people are still alive. What is keeping them alive? Who is carrying this big shoulder that Capital is not caring because they are displacing people. They don't need their labor anymore. Government is trying social grants here and there, but it's not enough. They're not providing the basic. The healthcare is in shambles. Education is, so, but people are surviving. And the question then is, who is keeping these people alive? Where I do my research, I see young men in the streets all day, and I just ask, so who buys your shoes? You're not working. What did you eat? And the answer always, if it's not the grandmother, it's the aunt, it's the sister, it's my mom's so-and-so. It's the poor black women who are carrying the burden of this huge population that has been rejected by this capitalist system, right? So it's resistance because what is the other option? If I don't go and sneak and cut that wood and make sure the farmer doesn't see me, then I'm not going to cook. So I will go and sneak and risk being bitten by a dog or being shot. But I'm going to do it because it's a question of survival. So now if you think about land redistribution and other resources that need to be redistributed, is really about, we need to think about outside of this system because it has failed. It's just not working. It's making more and more people poor every day. We had just recently the statistics of unemployment in South Africa of youth. Isn't it around 70%? How do you explain that? Who's feeding those people? Because they're eating, even if it's not nutritious food, but they're eating something, they have clothes on. Somebody is paying for that, and who is that person? And how then do we create opportunities for the burden to be taken away from these poor women who are really, really, really caring? So people are going back from moving back to rural areas. So they need land. So land then becomes this crucial base for not just for producing food, but for living, for cultural purposes. There's graves there. There's a lot that makes us human that we need land for. So again, this debate around black people don't know how to farm. What are they going to do with the land, which is nonsensical, So it's really about challenging those narratives and thinking about this crisis and how do we get out of this crisis. Yeah, thanks.
Salimah? I would have loved to answer it in a very personal way. I'm also a poet, and that is key to my resistance and my survival. Getting out of all the bad news, what beauty can we find? But maybe, I've got a book over there, but I can't run over now. I think another way that we resist is by organizing. And just this morning, women farm workers launched this report, which I worked on with them. I have a copy for everybody here. In this report, we have demands around land, around healthcare, around education, and around a wealth tax. And that is how we resist. We resist by making demands. A lot of the women that I interviewed here started the strike in 2012 in the winelands. They were sidelined through the strike and, of course, in the writing of the history. But those women are back now. They're back. They've launched this campaign, and I urge us all to resist with them. Okay, I don't quite I have some copies, let me say that.
So maybe should we distribute the copies during?
Yeah, let me leave it here. Let me give you this.
And I think maybe my other question would be around, and this is also in relation to the previous panel, because I think it's a thread, right? Around commodified healthcare and global neoliberal capitalist labor practices. And I think it also goes back to what Asanda was saying, that even understanding the practice of mining beyond mining gates. So I'm interested in how we make of that connection between commodified healthcare, like we're seeing in South Africa, and also, I guess, global labor practices, in particular in mining towns, like what we saw in the documentary. I can start. I'll start with Ta.
No, please don't start with me.
I could start.
Resistance. Salimah?
I don't mind starting. I've written a lot about decommodifying healthcare in advance of the pandemic, but through the pandemic even more. I think the main labor link to make is the one that we heard in the last panel. The vast majority of healthcare professionals in this country, as in around the world, is female. It is women. Women in the form of nurses of all the various sorts. That labor is the basis for most public healthcare systems. And of course, in this country, where you have severe underfunding of public healthcare, who makes up the gaps? It's nurses. Nurses get a bad rap in this country, right? We really come down hard on nurses and their behavior. But what I propose is that we talk about how nurses are actually sustaining the fallout of the vast inequality that has built up in this country over centuries. So when we talk about decommodifying healthcare, it's about valuing the labor that is the backbone of the system, not just nurses, community health workers, getting paid a pittance, bringing it back to mining. When we talk to artisanal diamond miners in the Northern Cape, a good number of them were community health workers. They aren't being paid anything, right? They get a stipend. So they're doing the mining on the side. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those coal miners that we saw in the film also do community health work. So decommodifying means valuing that labor at a living wage minimum. It means allowing those workers to study further and move up in the labor, in the health labor. So in the different types of care that we need. And it's about getting rid of the 4 odd companies that control all of the medical technology in this country. You cannot have a public healthcare system where public funds are simply funneled to those companies, and they are organized in all spheres of healthcare to provide services to the public. You will run out of money fast. And I come from a country where people fought for public health care in the 1950s. And even there, a rich country, Canada, to this day, we have a public system. We don't have a single private hospital in the country. Everybody is served by the public system. But because we use all of the commodified medical goods, everything from PPE to the heart surgery machines, to the X-ray machines, to the medication. What has happened is that public money has gone up in terms of spending on those healthcare commodities for a profit, and spending on the main labor force, female labor force, has gone down from the 50s. So it is women that have sustained the public system. Why? Because women can be sacrificed. Even in a rich country, predominantly white, now becoming much more colorful, regardless. That is how capitalism works. So at this time, when we have gone through and continue to go through the pandemic, it is a time to mobilize around decommodifying healthcare and actually learning about what that means.
Thank you. Yeah, so two things to add on what Salimah, and she's done a lot more research on the health side than I have, but two things, and coming from the stories of women that I've worked with in the mining communities, and one is from just soon after the Marikana massacre, there were women gathering around one of the shacks in Marikana, got shot and needed to go to a clinic, and we went to this clinic rushing the woman, and the clinic was like, no, we cannot help this woman because she's not a mine worker. And that story for me, because it was so shocking. Here's someone bleeding, but here are the nurses being told by the mine that you cannot take or help people from this community where we are working. So that for me, I think it speaks to partly the question of commodifying healthcare. But also, I mean, going back to what Star was saying, that there is no wage. 70% or more of the youth are unemployed, over 34%, I think 36.2 in the latest statistics, of people in South Africa are unemployed. And this is, again, going back to the definition of unemployment, this is the narrow definition of unemployment, meaning the numbers of unemployed people in South Africa, if you're using the expanded definition, which includes people who have given up looking for work, we're talking about numbers that are close to 50% of the population. So every second person is unemployed, and I'm not including those who are at school and those who are not able to work because of disabilities and so forth. So the numbers are quite high. If you have privatized healthcare in such a country, what does it mean for people's day-to-day choices? I've heard people saying that, well, there's no food. I'm not going to go to the hospital with the little money that I have. Not only is there no food, I actually also just don't have the money for transport to the hospital because of where they are located. So it's not just the question of decommodifying. I think it goes to all of these other layers around the fact that also clinics are not in places where people can access them. So what do we demand then from the state? Because I think we do need to make these demands from the state. We need to make these demands for proper public health care. One that we can actually rely on. When you talk to people who use public hospitals, they'll tell you that I'm not going to go to the hospital because they don't even have a Panado, you know. So there's a lot of money that needs to be poured into the system itself, but not just the money that's poured into the system, but also we need to do things so that people don't end up in hospitals. There's so much that is not done. If people don't have food, they're struggling with food, they're going to end up in the gate of the hospital, obviously. If people don't have basics met, there's no way you can make, you know, so for me, it's yes, there's the need to decommodify health, but there's so many other layers that we need to look into so that people don't end up at the gates of the hospital. And obviously the need to push for the government. I mean, there's lots of debates that are going on around that, but there's a need to have a much more broader discussion around that.
Thank you so much. Star?
I totally agree with what Asanda and Salimah has raised. I'm not going to repeat that. But as they were talking about access to healthcare, I was just thinking also, I mean, healthcare, of course, is broad, but there's also psychological kind of healthcare that's required. And I was reminded, because where I'm doing my research, it's a community that was forcibly evicted in 1997, put in a truck and went dumped somewhere, and they lived in tents next to a graveyard for 10 years while fighting to get back their land. And so some of the questions when I ask them, so because I'm interested in what happens when people get their land back, right? And so when I ask, well, how was life in Mkukwin? They call it Mkukwin, that's where they were put for 10 years. And now, and most of them, they talk about like dignity as like a major thing. They say, oh, it affects, especially young people. They say it affected us psychologically so much that we would lie when our friends asked us, where's home in school? You don't want to say home is there because it was just so degrading. So for them, going back to that farm where everyone has their own room, there's space for dogs and cats and everyone, psychologically, it's done a lot. I mean, they're still struggling, there's no work, there's no, but the difference between living in a tent and you are 8 and having to move back to where there's just space. So it's like, so that's going back to the point where I say, why land is so important for people beyond just the agricultural production. Yeah, that's just the point I wanted to emphasize.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that reflection on the politics of space is very, very important. Very, very important. I think in just maybe the last 10 minutes or so that we have, I'll give our panelists 2-3 minutes to give me your conclusionary thoughts. I don't know if that's a real word. Decolonizing, creating, making new language. This is feminism in action, guys. Discussing, recreating. Yeah, just maybe your final thoughts. And I think another thing that we really didn't get an opportunity to reflect on, and something I'm really interested on is also on the politics of language, right? Language in mining towns. So we know Mfanakalo, I think that's what it's called, and how it's so popular in mining towns. But for some reasons hasn't really expanded in other areas. And I think that also speaks to how women are social creators of life, right? And creators of language, right? Of making sure that the language and the legacy also grows. And I think that would have been such an interesting conversation to reflect on, that we've seen and we've got the evidence that what happens in society when we continue to exclude women, right? Yeah, but maybe in your final 3 minutes of just conclusion, I was gonna say that word again, but anyway. I'll start, yeah, we're making new terms. This is, yeah, she didn't die, she multiplied, guys. I don't know, I feel like I'm always asking you to start.
It's okay.
So, you ready? Okay.
It's okay, well, to conclude, I suppose, I mean, when we're talking about making women visible, there's a lot of things that we also need to shift. A lot of times when we're talking about people in the forefront, we also reinforce this very idea of who's visible and who's not visible. And I think we need to, in our discourses, shift this whole focus on particular public spaces. Because I think from what's emerging here is that women don't resist always only in these big public spaces, but also there's a lot of resistance that's happening. It's in the everyday. You know, someone, I think it was Kawekazi was talking about these nurses and the work that they are doing every day, right? It's not in the big, grand narratives. It's also in the very everyday ways of being. That so. When we're thinking about resistance, thinking really about everyday and taking seriously the everyday, but also taking seriously, I think, the home, which is where most of us spend our time, especially now with COVID, right? The home is also another space of resistance. It's not just the big podium. In the case of the work that I do, it's not just the Marikana Gopi, but it's also in the community. That's where there's a lot of resistance. So when we're wanting to make women visible, we need to shift our gaze and think about all of these multiple spaces where resistance is happening. But the second one is also shifting the ways in which we think about what constitutes political practice, right? Because again, that influences and shapes how we think about what political practice is or what resistance is. If we think about resistance as these big things, we're not thinking about resistance in its granular forms and in the everyday. We're gonna miss the work that women are doing every day as a form of resistance because we're so locked in the big masculine narrative about what constitutes political practice and resistance. I think that's another one. And then the dominant forms of resistance that people in South Africa, we saw because of the history of the country, we tend to think of it as you are going to doi outside. But actually there's multiple forms of resistance. And for me, one of the stories of resistance that always inspires me is the stories of the beer brewers in the 60s, 70s. Those women who were brewing beer and they were just, they were just doing their thing as black women needing to survive, as Ta was saying. Yet that was a form of resistance that had a direct impact on labor, on production, because men would go and drink beer, and it got to a point where the state was like, actually, if we have a bigger threat in this country, it's not the men resisting at work, it's these women who are doing beer. Because women brew beer, men go and are in the beer halls the whole weekend, and it affects productivity at work. It does not just affect. So for me, I think such stories really make one think, okay, actually then if we need to think about resistance and take it seriously, we must really think about all of these spaces we've been taught not to look at, and all of these actions that we've been taught aren't as significant when we're thinking about resistance. And I think that's where I think I'll sort of end it. Thanks.
Sir?
Okay, so maybe another thing that I've been very appreciative of doing this current research that I'm doing now for my PhD is having opportunities to speak to people in their 80s, hearing from them what land dispossession meant, right? So these are people who still have fresh memories, who can tell you, I was standing at that corner, I saw a truck coming this way, my daughter was doing this. They can tell you what the white man was wearing on that day, even his hairstyle, and the words he said before he set their house on fire, So, and I've been very appreciative of having those opportunities, because I'm reading history on forced removals in South Africa, but now reading it against these life histories I've been conducting, and realizing that there's a lot that's missing, again, because it depends on who's been writing these histories of forced removals, what kind of questions were they asking, and their positionality, and what kind of questions I'm asking, and the answers that I'm getting, and reading the two against each other, and finding, wow, there's so much value. And I mean, they're in their 80s, they won't be around for long, and then how do we document this work and make sure we don't lose it? Yeah, so that's my closing point. Thanks.
Thank you. Salimah?
I would like to give you that poem that I mentioned from my new book, 29 Leads to Love. I think love is what we need to learn from these women that Sta is interviewing, the women who have led the strikes, the women who are resisting every day. There's a love there that is bigger than all of us. And I saw it when we went to the artisanal mining site just outside of Kimberley. And it was sunset when we arrived, and this is the poem that came. Diamond Sunset, Somalia, Northern Cape. There's an emancipating thrill to be amid Africans without borders, and rock and soil riddled with crystals and the occasional diamond. Sensual sifting of soil spotted by hue, thrashing of pick, stones, rage, cage tension of the centuries, focus, patience, sorting with a vision for the future. But the permitted scourge of the company, mining without the historical claim of the miners, scourge of police and security, trying to push miners patch to patch, scourge of home affairs coming for migrants, the scourge of dusty eyes, parched lips, gritty teeth, one tap for 4,000, is the violence of the market, disrupted only by a desire for land as large as sky, not to hold it, to touch it with heart and eyes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks to you.
Please give them a hand. It's really been a privilege to talk to all of you. I admire all of you. You are like literally fangirling moment. But thank you so much. It's been a privilege, and I'm pretty sure we've all learned so much from our wonderful panelists. We're going for lunch right now, I think. Yes, we're going for lunch, and then we are coming back. It will say there, I don't know what time. But thank you so much for being an amazing audience. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like. Thank you.
Thank you.